Hello, my name is Jacquelyn Sundberg, and I work with ROAR at the McGill Library. And ROAR is a fun acronym that stands for the Special Collections Units in the library. That is the Rare Books and Special Collections, the Older Library of the History of Medicine, the Visual Arts Collection, and the Archives. Those 4 units get some fun things to do, but first I want to take care of a few housekeeping notes, and then I will introduce our speaker. So, housekeeping. And before I continue, we are recording this meeting. You should have gotten a warning on your screen in Zoom. We are recording it so that we can distribute it afterwards. For those of you who are watching after the fact, welcome to YouTube. So that's the final housekeeping note. So I'll move on to more fun things. Before we begin for real this time, I want to acknowledge that while we are all meeting from all over, as I see from the chats, Bloomington, Connecticut, Alaska, Florida, Santa Barbara, well, we're jealous of your weather. It's very snowy in Montreal. We're meeting from many different places, either from our homes, our work from home spaces, or from our offices. We're meeting and exchanging ideas from particular places with particular histories. And here I'm sitting on the downtown Montreal campus of McGill University. This territory is the traditional territory of the Kenyan Kehaka people, and this place has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. We recognize and respect those people who have been meeting here for generations, and we recognize the Kenyan Kehaka as the traditional custodians of this land and the waters that surround it, where I, for my part, am meeting with all of you today. And today actually brings together people, objects, and ideas from all over, as we've seen. Our guest, Kristen, she has strong ties to Alaska, roots in Alaska, and welcome to those of you who are tuning in from different time zones. If it's early, thank you for getting up. I come from Alberta in Western Canada originally, and many of the manuscripts and fragments that we will be learning about today come from Italy and Northern Europe and from times long past. So we're bringing together things, disparate ties from different places today, and it's really a pleasure to be able to facilitate that kind of meeting of ideas and exchanges. So Montreal and the University Collections does bring us all together, and I'm delighted today to welcome Kristin Howard to give us a new way of interacting and working with the extraordinary manuscripts in our library collection. As a historian and a knitter, Kristen will bring medieval manuscripts to life for us today by exploring a little bit of the history of illuminated manuscripts and how to transform them into handknits. And I have strategically laid out my sampler in the background. You can see it over my shoulder. I chose the letter K for my son. We'll all come away with a new understanding of book history and a modern colorwork knitting pattern. So welcome book lovers, historians, crafters, knitters. She has created for us an alphabetical knitting pattern, which dovetails really nicely with our own alphabetical focus. This last year, we actually created a movable pop-up book that is an alphabet book. So an A to Z tour through some of our collections. And this is a microcosm. It's an A to Z tour through some of the illuminated initials in the collections. And our book is actually launching in March, and I can only hope it'll be as warmly received as Kristen's pattern was on Ravelry. After Dr. Howard talks, we will hear from Rare Books librarian Anne-Marie Holland, who's curator of the Medieval Manuscript and Incunabula collection, to give us context on the fragments and manuscripts in the library holdings. So let me introduce Kristen in a more formal way. She is currently working on becoming a librarian. She's working on a Master of Information Studies here at McGill University. So she'll soon be on the other side of these events as a librarian. She completed her master's and PhD in history from the Division of Late Medieval and Reformation Studies at the University of Arizona in 2020, focusing on early modern European history from 1500 to 1800. Her current academic research focuses on social welfare and medical care in early modern Switzerland, and her work has been published in Footnotes, a journal of history, and she has an upcoming publication which is in preparation entitled, or in the publication, Charity and Poor Relief in Christian Europe, 1400 to 1800. Her presentation today brings another aspect of her work and interests into focus. Like so many of us, Kristen has spent a lot of time knitting during the past COVID crazy year. Her CV should now include the 13 sweaters that she completed in 2020, and of course, the new knitting pattern that she launched on Ravelry last week, the Manuscript Cowl. For those of you who are not a part of it, Ravelry is an online community of knitters and crochetters. And I apologize if I said crocheters wrong. It's one I usually only read. You can find her work on Ravelry as The Closest Knit. Kristin has combined her interests in creating this pattern. Using a historian's perspective and toolkit, combined with a love of colorwork knitting, she has opened up a new way of exploring our manuscript holdings. One manuscript in particular I know caught your attention, but I will let you tell us about that. So we're happy to have you with us, Kristin, and I pass the virtual microphone to you.
Thank you very much, Jacquelyn. Thank you everyone for being here. I am just beyond thrilled at the number of people who are interested in this topic, which I take to be the confluence of my training as a historian and my interest in rare books and manuscripts and my passion for knitting. So I want to take my time to talk a little bit about how and why I transformed this manuscript that McGill has digitized into a knitting pattern. But first, since I know we have a lot of knitters here, I want to show you my samples before I start sharing a PowerPoint slide. So I've made 3 samples. The bee is my original sample. So here you can see the bee as well as the back, and I'll talk a little bit about how I developed these patterns, the designs for the colorwork charts. My second sample that I think is my favorite one is an H. You can see I have the contrast ribbing here, which is one of the options in the pattern. And that's because I have, like many people, a black winter coat. And I like to have a little bit of color next to my face sometimes when I'm out in snowy Montreal. And I also have featured in this sample the Golden Illumination, which was actually the idea of one of my really wonderful test knitters who thought you could embellish the letters even further by adding yellow or gold yarn. And I had this golden mohair in my stash that I thought would be perfect. And finally, I have an A sample, which is a lower contrast sample for those of you who might be interested in less of the black and white look. So you can see what a lower contrast version would look like. All right, so I am now going to begin sharing my PowerPoint with all of you. And just to let you know, if you have me in speaker view, then you should see my slide and the little video of me to the right. And if you want to see the image of me bigger because I bring up my samples again, there's a bar that you can slide to the left and right that you should be able to resize the video if you have me in speaker view. All right, so how and why did I go from transforming this manuscript that you see here and some other items in McGill's collection to the pattern? So what I really wanted to do was try to bring more people to medieval manuscripts, more people to these rare books at a time when it's really difficult for us to get into libraries. A lot of libraries and reading rooms just simply aren't open right now. But many places like McGill Rare Books have digitized a large number of holdings. So even if you are in Alaska or New Hampshire, you can still see and experience these items that McGill has. And I wanted to be able to bring more people to these manuscripts. And through conversations with librarians and knitters like Jacquelyn, I realized that my passion for knitting was perhaps the perfect way to try to do this. So I want to start by talking a little bit about my background in archival research. So my own personal experience actually handling manuscripts. So here you can see a picture of me a few years ago when I was conducting my archival research at the Genevan State Archives in Switzerland. And I'm holding this very large manuscript. This is the main source where I took evidence for my dissertation. And I have a sample page on the left so that you can see a little bit of what this manuscript was like. So manuscripts are simply books that are handmade. People continue to hand make some manuscripts even after the invention of the printing press, like in the manuscript that I'm holding here. City of Geneva in the 16th century had a really wide and flourishing printing industry, but you didn't want to print everything. Some things you still wanted to write by hand. And that's the example of this manuscript. which is the records of social welfare and poor relief that were happening in Geneva during the time. So the magistrates would take notes on the poor relief that they were giving out, which allowed them to look back and see if they were making progress in helping alleviate poverty in the city. So we call this kind of source a descriptive source because it described what's actually happening on the ground. I also think of these kinds of sources as being really useful, which is not really a historical term, but you can see how useful it would be to have these records saved over time, not only for the people who were living in Geneva in the 16th century, but for people today like me who are interested in finding out what was happening at the time. Now, something that this manuscript lacks, in my opinion, is it wasn't intended to be beautiful. It was just intended to be useful. And while I was working on my dissertation and spending hours and hours and days reading the paleography, the old handwriting in the books, I was sometimes wishing that I had chosen to work on sources that were not only descriptive and useful, but also beautiful. And that kind of brings us to the manuscripts that inspired the knitting pattern, which are both useful as well as beautiful. So this is an example from McGill Rare Books and Special Collections. This is not an example of one that inspired this knitting pattern, but I absolutely love this fragment and perhaps it'll inspire my next one. We'll have to see. So this, like the manuscripts that inspired the pattern, is an example of medieval music. It's from a choir book, and it has not only the music that you can see, but also this really beautifully illuminated R. An illumination is just the adding of decoration and sometimes pictures, images to the text in order to bring something else out, perhaps to catch your attention, like at the beginning of an important passage, or to give more meaning to the text than just the words alone. Now, as I said, this is not one of the ones that inspired me for this pattern, and I want to show you some images of the ones that I worked with for the pattern. And in particular, I'm going to start by showing you manuscript 73. And we're going to start by looking at the kind of exterior, because I want to give you a feeling for the size of this manuscript. So on the right, you can see the dimensions. However, it's such a large book that it's hard to understand how big it is without seeing it in real life. So we have this wonderful image of Jacquelyn and some others around the book. And you can see that when it's opened, it's nearly 3 feet wide. It's an enormous book. And you might be wondering, why would a book be so big? So this is a choir book. And choir books were used in the Middle Ages and Renaissance for singing during the liturgy, during the Mass, as well as the hours, special times of day when monks and nuns, as well as sometimes the laity, would say particular prayers. And so unlike choir books today, where in a choir or perhaps in a church, you're likely to have your own kind of small individual book, these illuminated manuscripts were very expensive to make. And so you couldn't have everyone with their own little book. And instead you would make a large book that many people, the entire choir, would be able to use at the same time. So that's why we have such large books. And the addition of the illumination also increases their value monetarily as well as aesthetically. And this image of Jacquelyn and the others is from a 2019 event at McGill Rare Books and Special Collections, led by Professor Julie Cumming of the McGill School of Music, where a choir actually sang the music from the book. So this is another way, of course, in which to bring this manuscript alive. And lucky for all of us, that performance is available on YouTube. So you can go ahead and watch that whenever you'd like. And after this event, we're going to put together a playlist with this video, as well as a 10-minute video about the digitization of the manuscript. And to all you knitters, it'll be the perfect accompaniment to casting on your cowl. So we'll have that for you. Now, I also want to tell you a little bit about the binding of this book so that we can get even more of a flavor of the manuscript. So these two images show you kind of the three-dimensionality of those brass bosses on the manuscript. So it is blind stamped leather on wooden boards, and then it has those brass bosses that are very different from the kind of bindings that we see today, but not altogether uncommon in the Middle Ages. Okay, so now I've talked to you about the size and you've seen the outside, but let's get into the inside of the book because that's what really inspired the pattern. So here are two images from the manuscript, one from kind of the beginning of the manuscript and one from kind of the middle. So this manuscript is comprised of 10 independent units, which are called quires, and each is likely the result of different scribes and artists all bound together. So different fragments put together. And this image gives you kind of a nice demonstration of how we can tell that they are different pieces put together. On the left, we have an example of a pen flourished style of illumination, whereas on the right, we have an example of painted illumination. So on the left, we have that red and blue ink, whereas on the right, we have many different colors of tempera paint. And there are also other things that are different about these two folios, these two pages. We can see that the size of the margins are very different, as is the way in which the music is put on the page. First of all, you can tell that there are more staffs of music on the right, whereas versus on the left, even including that addition of the text at top. So those are all kind of clues that tell us that these are from different areas, different times, different scribes, different illustrators. Now you might be thinking that's a really strange thing to have different bits of book all put together, but manuscripts in the Middle Ages and early modern era, buying a book was very different from buying a book today. Whereas today we go to the bookstore, or more likely right now, go online and we buy a book and we get the pages inside and the cover together. It was different in the past. So in this time period, you would buy the interior of a book separately from the exterior. So you could go to one merchant to buy the pages, to buy the text, or you could pay a particular group of scribes and illuminators to make the insides. And then you would take your pages to a different merchant, to an artisan who would then bind it all together for you. And you could choose different styles of binding depending on your tastes as well as on how much money you had. So you could get something very simple, a paper binding, or something really grandiose like leather with brass bosses. So it's not altogether unusual to see different fragments put together into one binding. Now, I also wanted to tell you that there has been some recent research by two PhD candidates, Alessandra Agnesti at McGill and Alessian Marziali Peretti at UDEM, and their research has demonstrated that parts of this manuscript were produced, used, and preserved in Genoa in a particular Dominican convent before it was bound together into its current format. And they argue convincingly, I think, that parts of this manuscript dates to the last decades of the 13th century. So they predated parts of this manuscript even a little bit earlier than we had previously thought. And so that's a dating that I've followed since they shared their research with me. So now you've gotten kind of your fill of these two pages, and I want to show you the other manuscript in McGill's collection that really inspired me. And this is right here. This is manuscript 74. Now you're thinking, this looks really different from what you just saw. This is not a large book. These are excised initials or cuttings. So these initials were cut out of a manuscript at some point. And this was kind of popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. As medieval manuscripts became more readily available on the market, people could purchase these little pieces, and they collected them for their own aesthetic value. And cuttings were often mounted into albums or framed or pasted into collages or displayed in a number of other ways. And this makes perfect sense, right? This is a lot more affordable, these little pieces, and they're still beautiful, whereas a large book is very expensive to buy. I think that, today I could imagine wanting to buy one of these little pieces, even if I couldn't personally imagine cutting them out of a manuscript myself. I could totally understand wanting to have one of these hung on my wall. So these 4 decorated initials you see here were the original inspiration for the charts that I developed for my knitting pattern. These are an example of pen flourished initials with fine linear embellishments in that red and blue ink, which is characteristic of the late Romanesque and Gothic periods, which is from about the 12th century to the 14th century. And the thin pen illustrations here include scrolls and crown motifs and beads. And so after looking through Manuscript 73 online and this beautiful image that Anne-Marie sent me, this is where I started designing the pattern. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how I went about creating my color charts. So that's demonstrated here. I started with the B because I thought that the B was just perfect. For whatever reason, I found myself very much drawn to the letter B. So first I developed a 3-color chart. That's the one here with red, white, and blue. And for those of you who aren't knitters, you might be looking at that and thinking, this is just 2 colors, it's red and blue. But remember that in knitting, we're not taking a piece of paper or parchment or vellum and applying ink, but rather starting with nothing, with a couple of sticks and some yarn. And so you have to include the background color as well as the foreground colors. And like many other knitters, I don't love knitting with 3 colors at one time. It's much trickier. So I decided that I wanted to develop a 2-color chart, a black and white chart. And so from the 3-color version, which I thought was fairly faithful to the manuscript, I developed this 2-color version, which is a bit less faithful, a bit more inspired. And that's how I developed the original B that you see pictured there and right here. So then I had to decide something else about my design process. Did I want to design an intarsia pattern or a fair isle pattern or a stranded pattern? So these are 2 different ways of knitting with color. In intarsia, you typically have just 1 color or a few colors in the middle and nothing happening around the edges. Whereas in fair isle, you have color work all the way around by carrying the yarn along the inside, as I'm showing you here. I am not a very skilled intarsia knitter. It is one of my knitting weak spots, I will admit. I much prefer knitting fair isle. So I decided that I wanted to develop a fair isle pattern. So I had to decide for a chart that was going to appear outside of the initials. So to decide what I wanted that chart to look like, I turned back to Manuscript 73 and I looked at the examples of initials like those on the screen here. And I really found myself drawn to these ones that have curves as well as those beads. And I decided that that is what I wanted to try to duplicate in a relatively easy and pleasant to knit way. And so that's what I have on the back, is this design that I settled on after some experimentation that is not circles itself, but gives the illusion of curves and also has the beads that kind of duplicate what we see, especially inside the N and the O here. So that's how I got to the original B pattern. Then I had to think about the other letters of the alphabet, and it turns out that there are a lot, which of course I knew getting into this, but I hadn't really thought about developing all of the charts. So then I had to decide, did I want to continue copying as faithfully as I could from the manuscripts, or did I want to have more inspired letters? And so I ended up doing a combination of the 2. And so I'll give you a couple of illustrations of that. So first is the H sample. And the H is as close to the letter H that you see on the screen there as I could possibly make it. I decided to be as faithful as possible with this one. This didn't work well for all letters, however. Some letters appear only infrequently in Latin, like K, not very common capital letter in Latin. And some others just didn't translate as well into a knitting pattern. And so some I kind of strayed from what I saw in the manuscript, and the M is an example of that. So when you see the letter M from the manuscript, as I show you on the screen here, you can tell that it's an M in the manuscript. It's quite clear. But I thought that if I were to take this shape out into the world outside of the manuscript, that it wouldn't really be clear what it is because it's so different from the modern M that we see today. And so as you can see in the sample that one of my test knitters made here, I copied some elements of the M from the manuscripts that are unusual, like the closed bottom, as well as kind of the curves that we see. But I changed the top to have the 2 arches that are more typical of a modern M. So here I kind of did a little bit of both. I copied what I saw in the manuscript, but I also moved a bit away. Now, since I'm showing you one of my test knitter samples here, I wanted to show you the gallery of the samples that we have so far. So the bottom 3 are the ones that I've knit. You can see that I have this particular way I like to style my finished objects. And the 3 on top are from my really wonderful test knitters. Thank you so much to you 3 for knitting these. I really appreciate all of your hard work. And this helps you see how the pattern can look in different styles with different colors and with different yarns. And so if you're interested in knitting, you have like a nice little gallery to look from here, as well as Jacquelyn's recently finished cowl as well. Now, I also wanted to give, before I finish, a few knitting resources, and I believe we're going to send out these links separately later on for those who'd like them. So if you were here for the history content, the book content, and now you're interested in learning to knit the perfect pandemic hobby, I recommend the information that you can find from Very Pink Knits. And for beginning patterns, I highly recommend those from Tin Can Knits, who are a pair of Canadian knitters who make wonderful patterns. And if you are a beginning knitter and you haven't tried Fair Isle yet, you haven't tried your hand at 2 colors, Tin Can Knits has a really wonderful free pattern for a cowl anthology that would be the perfect project before jumping into this one, which is a little bit more complicated because it has some really long stretches of one color, which leads to what we call long floats in knitting. And if you're unsure how to catch long floats nicely, I have a link here to a video from Chai Knuckles Knitting. Amy is a knitting instructor in North Carolina who I once upon a time took a class on steeking from, and that video is how I learned to catch long floats, and it's really wonderful. And if you've seen this and you want to make your own knitting colorwork charts from medieval manuscripts or from anything else, Stitch Fiddle is the free application that I use to develop my colorwork charts. And so that's a wonderful place to turn to if you're ready to start designing yourself. And finally, if you're interested in contacting me, I have all of my links up there. I'm on Ravelry and Instagram, which is where I have my knitting content. And on Twitter, I have a bit more of my professional historian librarian content, but a bit of knitting in there now as well. And McGill Rare Books has a really wonderful Instagram that I highly recommend that you follow. And so just before I sign off and turn over to Anne-Marie, I just wanted to end with this concluding thought that what I really wanted to bring out here is that we can continue to engage with rare books, even books that are hundreds of years old, from afar and no matter where we are, because of the wonderful resources of digitization and what libraries like McGill have put together for us. And there are many ways in which to engage with these books. We can open them on our computers and page through them like a real book. If we can sing from these as well. If you are like me and not a singer, but you appreciate it, you can listen to the choral performance, which is absolutely wonderful. And we can also be inspired by the images and the illustrations within these books to make our own objects and to bring them to life in a different way. And that's what I really hoped to do here with my knitting pattern. And so thank you all so much for being here and for looking at the pattern. And please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. And I will go ahead and stop sharing and turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Now so everybody has been posting really interesting things in the chat. I'm going to spotlight myself for the moment, but I'm going to introduce Anne-Marie, and she's going to give us a little more context about the manuscripts that Kristen was working from. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation, and then we're going to open it up for questions for Kristen and for Anne-Marie as well. So Anne-Marie is the curator, and she's one of our rare book librarians, and she's the curator of the Medieval and Incunabula collection. So like you saw in the photos, I had the opportunity to interact with Manuscript 73 and kind of build my dream event when we sang from that choir book a couple of years ago. And now I had my fingers in the mix with Kristen as she was thinking about things to use in our collections when she was starting to think about creating patterns. And I said, these would be great, or this is my favorite book, something along those lines. And she took this idea and ran with it. So Anne-Marie, can you tell us a little bit more about the range of our medieval collection and the manuscripts that are in it?
Oh, yes, I'd love to. And thank you so much, Kristen. It was such a wonderful talk. And I think it is definitely the most imaginative project we've had thus far with medieval manuscripts at McGill. We love the interactiveness of this project. So knit away. We have about 250 medieval manuscripts, Western European manuscripts in Latin and in some early vernacular languages, and they span mostly from the 14th to the 15th centuries. So like a core component of our collection would be specimens of books of hours. And when I say specimens, we have both codices and fragments. So I'm showing you now the slide, and Jacquelyn will confirm.
Just a moment, if you could reshare your screen, Anne-Marie, that would be great.
Okay. Resharing, sorry about that.
That's fine.
And full screen.
There we go.
Is that working full screen now for you?
Not quite, but we can see it. So we'll leave it for now. But we can see it. We're seeing Ore. There we go.
There we go. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So we have 37 medieval manuscripts that are qualified as books of hours. And I've given you the link here so that you can connect to them. They're fully digitized, and there has been a lot of work done on them in terms of description. They're meant to give you more insight into the nature of these beautiful, richly decorated items. And it's open access. So please do look up our Book of Hours component. And just recently, there's been of the antiphonals component, Kristin Howard was making use of some of the initials in MS-73. So it would be part of this new project called the Cantus Database for Latin and ecclesiastical chants. Please do look this up. It's just hot off the press, so to speak, as a digital project, and involves some 40 of our antiphonals and graduals. So apart from these two core components, we do have historical documents, signed deeds and charters. We don't have time to actually go into them. They're less embellished, of course, but please do understand that we have a wide range of materials.
It's interesting. I'm scanning the live captions as this is going as well, and there's some funny things that don't translate quite right. So Cantus is spelled with a Q in the captions. So if the auto transcribe isn't quite perfect, apologies for that. But yes, it's such a great resource, and it's really interesting to see the different directions that these ever research and study that these support today. My next question for you is actually on my phone, which I am opening. But it's along the lines of exploring a little bit further what you've showed us here. Who uses the collection primarily today?
I'm just going to give you another example as
sure.
I explain. Yes, we, well, librarians and curators use the collections in order to promote the collections and exhibitions and public tours. We also have professors who come and bring their students in order to examine a particular aspect of our holdings. So they may be interested in the notarized deed section of our holdings, or in the illuminated examples in order to understand graphic design. We do have college students in graphic design coming to consult our medieval collections. We also have curators from leading museums, such as the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, who borrow our collections quite a bit. So there are objects in several exhibitions. It could be near and far. And then we have really high public interest from an innovative project such as what Dr. Kristin Howard has just described to us. And international researchers, pre-pandemic, were coming on site to examine our specific leaves, because as much as we digitize them, they still require some on-site close-up examination and touching.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the images that Kristin showed was a series of those excised initials that she drew inspiration for the colorwork patterns from. Could you tell us a little bit about why we have fragments like that were at one time clearly a part of a larger volume, but now we have only the initial or only the image in some cases?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So each one of these items is unique and bears parts of history to it. I'll just give you the back of, or the full leaf that belongs to that initial I was showing is here. And you see some of the ways we can qualify it. But fragments are just as valuable today for researchers as they try to gather these fragments together. There's a new science called fragmentology. And what we're trying to do now is to sew back or to knit back these several pieces that are really scattered in institutional repositories and even in private collections around the world. So there's this endeavor that makes the fragment interesting. Why we have the fragments in the first place is because Dr. Lomer in the 1920s, who was the university librarian, decided to create a small museum called the History of the Book Museum. And it was his idea to have a representation of a wide array of styles from different regions. And of course, Kristen did mention that availability and cost of these items was all a factor in how we were able to construct this kind of collection.
Yeah. Now, we saw some lovely images of manuscript 73, which is quite monumental in size. Is everything in the collection like that big, or are a lot of these, can you give us an idea of the dimensions of some of these other manuscripts?
Yes, so the dimensions, there are very few bound codices, so book format and bound. That is because, you know, we're talking about scarcity and longevity of manuscripts that are now dating, you know, to the 13th century. So they've not survived always in their original bindings. And I think the Champ book is close to its original binding. So that's very nice. We do have examples of bindings that were put on later in the 19th century, or even bindings that are brand new. We've had some restoration projects and conservators have decided to do a period style binding, but they're brand new. But in terms of the proportion of the collection, we have mostly fragments. And as you see on this screen, we're giving you here a little bit of the sale information. So we were saying how our collection was built a lot in the 1920s and 30s. So this one comes from a sale by Sotheby's in London. We were working with European dealers quite a bit. And we purchased it March 1923, and it was part of a large lot of initials. So we were able to pick this up, and the next slide, I believe, is going to show you another example of our purchase of excised miniatures. It is from a breviary from France, 1470, and I mentioned Dr. Lomer. This is him. He bought this at the request of some of our donors who were very active in suggesting purchases. The Redpath family was very much involved in this. Lady Roddick, a very astute collector, and Cleveland Morgan, who collected for the Museum of Fine Arts, helped us make the decision to purchase this for Dr. Lomer's History of the Museum theme.
It's interesting because these, I think you can also see as part of ORE, or no, the online exhibition. Can you see, are these ones included there, Anne-Marie?
No.
No, they're not. Oh, okay.
They're in the Books of Hours. These would be in the Books of Hours digital website.
Okay. And we will, just to respond, we will send out links to the various digital exhibitions, as well as the pattern and other links, the knitting links as well. We'll send up a follow-up message with all of these links so you can explore. And we actually have a lot of people who are saying that the pattern that you created, Kristen, would translate well to other kinds of fiber crafts, which is quite interesting. And yes,
that was actually one of my hopes. I had this thought that so recently I've tried needlepoint and cross stitch and quilting, you know, pandemic, lots of crafts, and I had thought that people who had the skills and kind of the inclination might be able to take these charts and make them into other things. So not just taking the charts and making them into intarsia. So these would make like a lovely sweater front, for example. But also if you were able to change the size of stitches, because something about knitting stitches is they aren't perfectly square. And so it wouldn't translate exactly to cross stitch, but with that application that I stared, Stitch Fiddle, you can change the size of the graph that you're creating for yourself. So you, although the website purports itself as being for knitters and crocheters, I think that you could use it for some of these other crafts as well, if you were inclined to do so, which I think is pretty exciting.
Absolutely. And there's been some really interesting commentary in the YouTube chat as well as in the Zoom chat about projects that you could do with this, including comments on the rectangular or square nature of stitches. So yes, that is a concern. I myself have played around with Stitch Fiddle after you told me about it a couple months ago. And some images do lend themselves better to that program than others. But yes, we're going to open this up. So if you have questions for Kristen or Anne-Marie, put them in the chat or send us an email and we'll be accepting and fielding those. One of the first, of course, and perhaps most important is, Kristen, are you wearing a hand knit sweater? This is from Patty in North Carolina.
Of course I am wearing a hand knit sweater. I had to wear one of my hand knit sweaters for this presentation. I knit this one over the summer. It's White Horse by Caitlin Hunter on Ravelry. It's a paid pattern. And I actually used a sport weight yarn instead of a DK yarn, which is what the pattern called for, because I had this yarn on hand and it was begging to become a sweater. So this was one where I mess with proportions a little bit to get the size that I wanted. But so yes, this is a hand knit sweater. It's one of my favorites.
That's lovely. I confess, so my sample, I made the letter K as well. And I used a yarn, which was not your recommended yarn, but I swatched and found the dimensions were relatively right. And I liked the colors. And more importantly, it was from a local shop and I could pick it up, I could order it and pick it up the next day and I didn't have to wait for delivery. So supporting the local yarn stores, a shop in Verdun, here in Montreal, that's where I got my fibers. And it was quite fun. But we do have some comments actually and questions, not relating to the yarn, relating to the books themselves. And this one, maybe I'll direct to you, Anne-Marie, or Kristen, both of you, maybe Anne-Marie first. Asking about the nature of these works. Were they largely works of religious orders or members, or do we have any examples of secular works from this time period? Oh, Anne-Marie, you're muted.
You know, I've been on a million Zoom calls and you would think I've never used Zoom before. Pardon me. Yes, we do have mostly, I would say, done in monasteries by monk work. So commissioned maybe for private devotion, maybe for church service, but I wouldn't be able to say exactly which objects are not done in that way. There are a few that come to mind. You know, a commentary on Aristotle is a copy made much later of a medieval commentary, and that's most likely done in secular hand, right?
A follow-up question along the same lines, Kristen, Anne-Marie, either one of you. Do you know, would most of these artisans who are doing the illuminations, would these have been men? Would they have been women? Would they have been young, old, or just any insight on that question?
Anne-Marie, do you want to go ahead? So my impression from studying these kinds of books is that it can be kind of all over. So I think that we often think that scribes and decorators, illuminators were men. However, many of these kinds of manuscripts were made in convents. And so it was women who were making them. Of course, there were also men attached to convents, but the primary inhabitants of convents were women. So we really think that both genders and people of all ages, because you can go into a convent or a monastery at any age, we're working on these projects. It did take, of course, some special training. So It's unlikely that children were doing this because it took a number of years to learn how to do this well. And you're not going to trust children with gold or other things like that in order to illuminate the manuscripts. So after a certain amount of training and time and proving that you were going to be skilled enough to perform this really important and expensive labor. But yes, people of not all walks of life, but people of both genders and of any age could have been involved in making these kinds of manuscripts with the writing and the illumination. I don't know as much about the creation of vellum. I know a little bit about it, but not quite as much, but I would imagine that it was mostly men who were master artisans creating vellum, and so they'd be a bit older.
Yes, and for those of you who don't know, vellum is made from animal skin, so it's highly durable. Someone asked a question about wearing gloves when handling these manuscripts, and actually manuscripts from this time period are impressively durable. Vellum is very durable. So that's one of the things. It stands up well, but it does show the wear and tear of human hands. That particular choir book that you worked from, I was turning the pages and the corners are worn and there's oil stains on the corners from years of people handling it and turning the pages as you sing. And the production level on those is an interesting process too, because the lines would be done by one person and then they would be filled in, the notes would be put in by somebody else, and the illuminations would be put in by somebody else. So the final product that you get is a collaboration, it's by nature, which is kind of interesting as we translate it to these modern days. And we put the same amount of time and dedication into crafting an initial in a different medium, which is really lovely. A follow-up question about knitting and that from that time period actually is, somebody prefaces this by saying it might be a silly question. I don't think it's a silly question. Do we know anything about color work or stranded knitting from that time period? Were people doing color work in the Middle Ages? Do you know?
That's a wonderful question. I don't think so, but I'm not sure because I've looked into a little bit about the history of spinning fibers and those kinds of things. I'm not sure how early Fair Isle would have started. Somebody might actually know who could tell us in the chat who knows a bit about the history of multiple color knitting in the UK as well as in the Scandinavian countries. But people definitely were knitting in early modern and medieval Europe. I haven't seen any examples of more than one color at once, but there's this really wonderful project called Knitting in Early Modern Europe. And there are some researchers in Europe who are trying to look at knitted garments that were made early on. And they've mostly looked at hats, caps, and there are a few other things. And this group of researchers is working not only on knitting, but also on sewing. So if that's another one of your crafting hobbies, this group has a kind of a series of books called The Tudor Tailor is I think the original one. There are a few other more recent ones that have patterns, mostly sewing, but also knitting for garments appropriate to the Tudor era. So not the Middle Ages, the early modern period, but
I have to add, someone put something in the chat, actually. We have in Zoom, there's a cushion apparently from 1275. And it scrolled on me. Fernando de Acerda is buried in Spain, and there's a cushion that apparently is stranded knitting from 1275.
I knew that somebody would know.
And there's a competing answer in the chat. So please keep talking about that. We have a question, actually, I'll turn it back to the topic of the books of hours. There's a general question. What is the content of a book of hours? Maybe we can just, Anne-Marie, do you want to take that one?
Oh, I can let Kristen handle that unless, go ahead.
Absolutely. You can add if I'm missing anything. Yeah. So the hours are the times of day at which you would say particular prayers. And so a book of hours is a collection of the prayers that you would say at the particular times. And I can't remember the names of all of them. I would have to have written that down for myself, but Matin or Matins is one, and then there are many others. And so the book of hours is your kind of personal devotional book that has the prayers that you would say at those times of day. And these are often heavily illustrated and illuminated with really beautiful illuminations that are not just decorated initials, but inhabited or historiated initials with images of people and things going on in them as well as other illustrations. McGill has some beautiful, beautiful medieval books of hours online. And I had looked through a number of them to see if I got inspiration for the knitting pattern first. And a lot of them they're either a little too detailed or had too many colors for me to think about how to pull them off in a knitting pattern effectively, but they're absolutely gorgeous. And I highly recommend going and looking at them.
There's a follow-up question about the topic of illustrated versus illuminated, and why we use the word illuminated for these manuscripts. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, so illuminated specifically refers to, when it's used properly and specifically, it refers to the use of fine metals like gold. But I think that we tend to talk about any extra, excess, beautiful illustrations as illumination. And the reason we use the word illumination is because this use of gold and other metals lights up the page. And I believe, and Anne-Marie, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, that illustration is the more appropriate term when we're not talking specifically about metals, but many of these books include even at least a little bit of gold, even if not a ton of it, as much as you could afford to have had put in your manuscript. And so we use illuminated more generally to talk about these kinds of hand illustrated, illuminated, and written books.
You touch on an interesting point, the economics of these books, how costly illuminated manuscripts would have been at the time to produce, because there's a question here about parallels between the economics of knitting with some of our beautiful, expensive hand-spun fibers or hand-dyed, wherever you're sourcing your fibers. That can be quite costly, and the pigments used in illuminating and the metals used in illuminating these manuscripts was quite costly as well. It was a limiting factor, of course, in the production of these books. How do you think that what do you think about the comparison between materials, between knitting and fiber crafts today and these illuminated books that were your inspiration for the pattern?
I think that that's a really interesting suggestion. I think that those of us who are knitters know that some of the most beautiful patterns today are more expensive than we might hope if we use the recommended yarn. And I think, illuminated manuscripts were definitely cost prohibitive for the vast majority of individuals during these time periods. People were not going to be able to afford to have these large books made. There are some popular recent knitting patterns that with the yarn suggested, I find them cost prohibitive. So I think that is an interesting, I think one of the recent examples of a knitting pattern that was beautiful and the largest size was going to cost something like $500 US in order to buy the yarn. And that's, I think that there might be something there to the comparison. I would not be surprised if during the Middle Ages, people were thinking about ways to create smaller versions, to buy maybe, little pieces, to not have them bound in such grand binding, to not have as much illumination, to have ink illumination instead of painted, just in the way that many of us today, when we're knitting, think, I like that pattern. How can I make it affordable to me? Which is definitely something that I do. I just told you I used not the recommended yarn for this pattern. I used what I had on hand and readily.
That's my regular practice as well. We have more questions. I'm cutting you off a little bit, Kristen. I apologize. We have a lot of questions in the chat, and we unfortunately won't have time for all of them. So I am going to hand it over to Colleen Cook for thank yous in a couple of minutes, but we have time for maybe one or two more questions. And I'm trying not to, this is entirely random, the way that they're coming through. So apologies if your question didn't get answered. We want to continue the conversation. So we will send out a follow-up email, but you can reach out via social media channels that we'll share as well. One thing, the question here was actually about illuminated manuscripts or these kinds of things that were not from a Western European or Christian tradition. And wondering about in our collections if we have examples of manuscripts that are not from a Western point of view or not produced in a Christian tradition, and whether we could possibly translate those into patterns as well. Oh, Anne-Marie, maybe you could take that one.
Sure, I'd love to take that one. Yes, I've only mentioned the Western European manuscript holdings. They're, I think, the most plentiful. So we do have, for instance, Hebrew manuscripts, Armenian, we have Persian language manuscripts. It's a Greek manuscripts. They're dating later than perhaps the 15th century, So they would go into the 17th century because, as you mentioned, not everything was simply translated into a printed book after 1450 and the printing press. So yes, the answer is yes. Please reach me, curator of the manuscript collections, to find out in detail how we can help you.
And yeah, I'll include Anne-Marie's contact email in the follow-up. So a huge thank you from me, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Colleen. If you want to unmute and start your video, we'll give you the final word.
Well, thank you. I too am a knitter. I'm also very privileged to be the dean of the McGill Library. I learned how to knit from my grandmother, who was an orphan in a convent in San Antonio, Texas, and learned from the nuns. In any case, I'm here to say thank you very much to Kristen, Anne-Marie, and Jacquelyn. It was fascinating from all vantage points, and Jacquelyn did a great job in steering us all through it. And thank you to everyone for coming. There are hundreds of you out there, and the chat is fascinating as well. The three other important thank yous, obviously, to the library events team who made today's event possible: Michelle MacLeod, Catherine Lewis, and Julianne Couture. To the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada for making these events possible with a very special kind of support that we very much need to be able to bring our collections and their fabric counterparts to you. And to generous private donors, Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley, for supporting these events. We hope to see you again soon at another event. And just quickly, our next one is February the 24th at 4 p.m. And it's the next meeting of the Roar Book Club. The books we love, reading in hard times, and it'll be hosted by another one of our Roar librarians, Chris Lyons. And the final event in our three-part series on alphabet and artist books will take place on March the 16th, a noon-hour tour through artist books with special guest Clara Drummond. And on Thursday, March 18th, we'll have a special trivia night to launch the library's latest digital game quiz, That's So. And of course, our own beautiful book, Amaze, which is, pun intended, amazing. A McGill A to Z experience will launch on March 30th. This is truly a book that will take your breath away. It obviously highlights many of the treasures that we have in our rare collections at McGill, and it's a pop-up book. And I have always been fascinated by pop-up books and didn't want my kids to play with them and mess them up. But this is one for adults. And I have to admit, the middle for P is this is a spoiler, but it's our restored printing press, and is absolutely will absolutely take your breath away. So again, I want to offer a particular thank you to Kristen, Jacquelyn, and Anne-Marie for a fascinating tour through knitting and our rare and special collections.
Thanks, Colleen. And thanks everybody for coming. Somebody just put a request, Colleen. They want to hear another episode of the story of knitting with your grandmother.
Oh, okay. Well, that'll be, I've got crazy stories.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.